Welcome to our video tonight. I'm trying it on a new screen player, and we will see how things go. It's kind of echoey to me now, so I'm not quite sure why. Let's see how this goes, okay? For some reason, I can't get the usual one to work tonight, so you just have to be patient with me. We're going to work on conclusions tonight. This is the final piece of the craft or the traits video before your nonfiction is due. It will be the final piece you put in place for your paper. Conclusions are kind of like the last piece of the frame. If the lead was the beginning of the frame, the conclusion is the end. And its purpose is to complement the introduction. Remember that it isn't just a mirror opposite. It isn't just a repeat, but it's meant to reinforce and to echo the material you state at the beginning of your essay. Just like a good writer doesn't begin their paper by jumping directly into the middle of the paper, you don't want to end it abruptly either and leave your reader hanging. You make your points and leave. That's not the point. The point of the conclusion is to satisfy the reader's need for closure. We want things to end up neatly. We want to have things kind of presented to us in some kind of a nice little package. So good conclusions reinforce the information. Reinforce doesn't mean repeat. In fact, they often echo the main idea or the thesis stated in the introduction. So if at the beginning you open up with a quote about giving back to your country through, let's say, I'm trying to remember what it's called, the Peace Corps, then at the end you're going to want to come back to that point without actually repeating what you laid out in the beginning. Remember, the conclusions are to give the reader a sense of where the paper begins and where the paper ends. So the introduction gives the reader a glimpse of what's coming, and the conclusion gives the reader a sense of looking back at what you've shown them. So it kind of gives them an idea of the ground that you've covered. You want to leave your reader with one final lasting impression. Remember, it's the last thing that they're going to read. So just like the introduction hooks the reader by raising their curiosity, the conclusion tries to leave the reader with something to think about, something that's going to still stay in their head even after they've walked away from your paper. Maybe it's a sharp final image. Maybe it's a lasting impression. Maybe it's a call to action. But you want them to leave with something in their head about the paper. Some hints for great conclusions. Use transition words that signal conclusion. Here are a few of them listed here, but be careful. Please don't try and make it the first word of the concluding paragraph. Most of the time it's in the middle of a sentence. Otherwise, it's just as obvious as saying, "And in my paper I have told you." You want to be subtle in your signals to the reader. Try repetition is another clue for a good conclusion. You could repeat a word or a phrase, like in this example, reading the classics, reading news, and reading textbooks. So the word reading over and over and over again helps emphasize your thesis. Or it could be a sentence fragment, like in this one, water down the drain, water from improperly placed, water used to wash driveways. That's a fragment that emphasizes a waste of water. And the very last line of the conclusion pulls those fragments together and shows the reader what they mean. A third way is to get emotional. And this means a couple of things. This means to show emotion as the writer. If you're passionate about something, your conclusion is where that passion can come through. But you also are thinking about ways to pull emotion or passion out of your reader. Remember that the emotion needs to be appropriate to your topic. Kind of like with the Gecko commercial where he gets so passionate about the flat tire. Not like that. But for an example, in this particular paper that I pulled this out of was about child neglect. And both the passion of the writer and an address to the passion of the reader are in the conclusion. Young children should not suffer. That's the writer's passion, but it's also putting a picture in the reader's mind to get them stirred up. Infants like Stephanie cannot call for help. They need you and they need me. That's a call to action. You're trying to get the reader to feel passionately about the writer's topic. A fourth way would be to use a quotation. And I gave you two real dependable quote sites here, Quoteland.com and BrainyQuote.com. Here's an example. This was the paper about Habitat for Humanity or Peace Corps volunteers. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy encouraged all Americans to ask what you can do for your country. Those involved in Habitat for Humanity asked and found a wonderful answer. Habitat volunteers, like those described in this report, work year-round to improve the lives of their fellow Americans. This particular paper, the introduction, was another piece from Kennedy's 1961 speech. Not the same piece that was included here, but another piece of it. A really good example of how to echo your lead in your conclusion. And finally, and this kind of ties back to what I just said, is to return to a technique you used in your introduction. So if you start with a scenario, a little story at the beginning, return to that same scenario at a later date. If you start with a quote from a person, finish with a different quote from that person. If you start with facts at the lead, then close with a different set of facts on the same topic. If you start with a question, try and end with a question. Remember, it needs to be connected but different. Okay? If you return to those techniques that you used in your introduction, it's a really good way to tie up loose ends and to add to a sense of wholeness of your piece, as long as you remember that returning does not mean repeating. Okay? Repeating sounds like you just ran out of words and you don't have anything else to say. Okay, remember, there's a few don'ts for your conclusions. You don't want them mechanical. In my paper, I have given you 3 reasons why. That's terrible. You also don't want to repeat your conclusion, your introduction word for word. Another huge no-no. Secondly, please don't cram everything you forgot to put in the body of your paper into your conclusion. Remember a rough rule that if it isn't in the body of the paper, it isn't in the conclusion. The only thing that should go in the conclusion are things that were fully developed in the body of the paper. The conclusion isn't like your last chance to say it all. Okay, your conclusion is like you're tying things up, you're getting ready to leave the reader with something to think about. So you can't add in ideas that you haven't developed earlier in the text. All right, I've given you some pretty solid strategies for conclusions, and they pretty much match the strategies you have for introductions. So remember, I expect you to be an active viewer of this video. Pause, rewind it, watch it again, do whatever you need to make sure you've captured all the important information. Make sure you take good notes. Remember the guidelines from the WSQ Changes video and the very specific guidelines I gave you. If you want me to sign off on your WSQ chart, the notes need to be the way I've required. Post your summary to the NYSNET conferencing link for your class and use the questions in your WSQ chart to guide you. Remember, I do not want a list of questions. I want a paragraph for your summary that includes the information those questions ask you for. And finally, make sure you write one question from these video notes. It could be a question you have about the notes. It could be an application question. It could be a question that challenges your peers' understanding. But if you want the question box signed off on your chart, make sure you have one good question recorded under your notes. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and I will see you in class.